after our last conversation and watching the comment sections and watching the comment sections on other videos by you and by others, I've been thinking about this because I'm still very interested in the BSV Bitcoin sphere, but my sense is that there's a certain level where you need a certain technical understanding to understand what's the difference between BTC, between BSV, all of that.
Sure.
But then there is very quickly like a level of, you can then obsess over technical details. And if you're a tech person, you need to do that because that's what will make the system run. But as an investor and or just somebody who's interested in it, that's not actually what gets you anywhere. And then I started really coming to this place that I think a lot of the questions people disguise as technical questions are actually philosophical questions. Like it's very much about, so what is a good economy? What does it mean to have a solid foundation in the monetary system? And all of those questions are then disguised as, or oftentimes disguised as technical questions. Oh, could it ever be more than 21 million? But I think it actually gets to these questions of what's the world viewed through an economic lens we want to live in.
Yep.
And I
agree. A lot of these things, I mean, Bitcoin itself is a technical system, but it's a technical system that was built with philosophy underpinning it. It's actually just a monetary system, and it's a monetary system based on incentives. And it's sort of like asking if you can pre-plan an economy. And I would argue that it's bad to plan an economy as you go, but what went into Bitcoin initially was, what have we learned from the last 10,000 years of global economics, and can we apply all of the good ideas and balance them with incentives and then set them free and let the free market do what it will? And I think that's the major disconnect between big blockers and small blockers, is that small blockers fundamentally believe that they can build a perfect technical system. They are very, very technocratic. And we're seeing this with the Taproot upgrade. They're super excited that Taproot's coming soon, and they're fundamentally changing all kinds of protocols again over on BTC because, well, it's not perfect yet, so we need to keep tinkering. And it doesn't make them bad people. It's just it is a mindset that there is something humans can do to make a perfect system, and then the perfect system will carry us to this, to the promised land, basically. And my contention for that is, well, we've seen people who think this way about economics, and we typically look at them as murderous dictators, and in hindsight. And this goes back to anybody from you can look at Lenin or Marx or even the Hitlers and the Mussolinis of the world, or you can go to Mao Zedong and say, if you read what they write, like it primarily comes from a place of hope, and it comes from a place of making a better world for either the working man or the whatever your nationalistic thing is or whatever. But they're looking at people as a whole, and they're saying, man, if we could just give these people a perfect tool, look how much greater the world could be. And, and then at the end of it, you look back 15 years later and it's, well, okay, a few 100 million people either starved to death or were killed for disobeying and all these things, because it was about the perfection of the system, and that the system needed to thrive first. And then the people that are born into the system will be able to just go off and create some incredible thing. And we've just never seen that in practice. And we see a subset of that also in fiat economies. This is very much what central banks do too. I mean, they're sitting there trying to pre-plan the perfect interest rates and the perfect distribution of wealth and the perfect amount of circulating capital and all these kind of things. And, to a degree,
completely insane during Corona. Just completely insane.
Yeah, it's bonkers. And I think a lot of people, fundamentally agree that that's the case, especially in Bitcoin circles. Like, hey, it's not good that there's another 20 or 30 or $40 trillion circulating than there was 2 years ago. But then you go back and you say, like, I had a debate with a guy about this El Salvador deal and BTC, and he was like, oh, well, they're going to be more free because of blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, two things. First of all, they're using a completely custodial service called Zap in El Salvador. And it's integrating with a fascist economy. So, I mean, they're the head of state in El Salvador is a fascist dictator. And then the other thing is that the thing that you're giving them, you're telling them is this fundamentally sound hard money, and it's literally in flux. It is going to be different in November than it is today. And so so we're having these conversations about hard money that can't change, and Bitcoin has never even gone a 4-year period without a very deep fundamental change in protocol. And so all of this,
you mean BTC in this case?
Actually, it really depends. There really hasn't been any implementation of Bitcoin that's gone that long. I mean, even BSV, the Genesis upgrade was done via hard fork, and it was not a contentious hard fork, but that was February of 2020. This is not even 2 years old now. So, we keep saying set in stone, or that the Bitcoin protocol was set in stone in 2009 when it was released and all of that. And people just can't stop tinkering with it. I mean, even Satoshi added the 1 megabyte block size limit, and he did it unilaterally, and these kind of things. It's like, well, we understand why. It was because of X, Y, and Z. And some of these things are fair. Like, it's not, we're not perfect. But the Bitcoin protocol is designed to function within that framework of the fact that we're not perfect, but we are competitive. It is this competitive nature of a free market that secures Bitcoin and gives Bitcoin value as a tool in business. And so it's really hard to get away from these notions, especially among software people. Software people think they can solve everything at their keyboards. And, I get that. That's what their training tells them to do. And it's even the way mentally that you're wired. You have to be very good at debugging code. And I mean, these are the kind of things that this is hundreds or thousands of hours of line by line. Why did it crash? Can it be more efficient? If I put the wrong word in the wrong spot, is it going to break the entire system? So there is a lot of power and responsibility that goes into that, but with that comes a lot of ego. And
it's also, it's exactly what you want a software engineer to do. You want them to do exactly that, and you want them to also know that the quality of their coding impacts the whole system. It's when we confuse the coding with the system, and that the code is not the system.
Precisely. It's the same thing. We've been having conversations for 10,000 years, frankly, about what is a human. Are we our body? Are we our soul? Are we our mind? Do we have to be a combination of the three? Or in, let's say in 200 years when we're all dead and gone, if there's video of me and you talking, like, is that still us? Like, do we still exist? And it's a little bit ethereal. Like, I don't know. There is record of our existence. You can hear our voices. You can see our faces. You can still feel the things that we feel, but we're gone. But are we? So it's exactly that. It's the system versus the parts of the system versus the people that maintain the parts of the system.
And I would love to just, because we went right in here, and I want to set the context a tiny bit more, because so just from a philosophical perspective, which is funnily enough what I studied, so what I like looking at is what do words mean, and what are we saying with them? It seems like you've made a really important distinction that I think is often missed or misunderstood, which is this distinction between a technocratic system and a human-based system, for lack of a better word, where the technocratic system would say, if we get the system right, the humans will follow along. Whereas the human-based system would say, no, humans will never follow along with the system. So let's build the system with that in mind. And I actually, you introduced basically perfectly what I would love to do with you today, where you said Bitcoin has taken these ideas from economy of what has not worked in the past and what has worked in the past, and has incentivized that. And I would love to look at those. Like, what are the ideas that are baked into Bitcoin, and unpacking that? Because I think that would be really interesting, so people can then look at them one by one.
Yep. I love it. Let's do it.
Wonderful. So we had one fundamental distinction already: technocracy, humanocracy. Is there a word for the other side of technocracy?
I think freedom, free markets, really. I mean, free markets and free people, and whatever it is they create is that thing. So maybe we need a word.
Which is interesting that we have a word for technocracy, but not really. There would be capitalism potentially, but then capitalism has very many different understandings.
Yeah, I think the word capitalism has a lot of baggage.
Yes.
And for context, anybody watching, the word capitalism was actually a derogatory term created by communists. So communists view the word capitalism as a criticism, and they're criticizing bank state, inflationary monetary policy, and that kind of thing. And I think actually some of their criticisms are fair. So I don't love the word capitalism either, even though in many ways I'm very much a capitalist. So it's it's one of those things where it's like we need better words.
So human-based system, human freedom.
Yeah.
I would assume that's a core element of Bitcoin as a system. Is humans own their Bitcoin, they can do with it what they want, and that's how the economy will be built, by one person at a time. Mm-hmm. Can you expand on that? Because I imagine that's a really core tenet.
So I think, when we see what people do with increased freedom and increased access to resources, and to an extent also worldviews that are positive and encouraging, that encourage that kind of thing, as well as just even things that you kind of can't bottle up, like just general worldview and that kind of thing too. Like you hear about the Protestant work ethic, for example, and it's like, well, what is that? Like how do you quantify the difference between whatever Catholics or Jews or Muslims versus Protestants, and how productive are they as people? And is that a worldview thing, or is it a function of the fact that most Muslims are in a place that has a different set of resources or that kind of thing? So there's a lot of weird social science to go into there, or anthropology, and figure some of that stuff out. But I think there's definitely an aspect of worldview that is very relevant there, and that would probably make for at least a 10 or a 12-hour podcast just to go into some of that and define those things. But I do believe that worldview is a cornerstone of anything that is productive. If you are raised to believe that it's your job to protect your family, build something great, leave the world better than you found it, and that kind of thing, and if then that becomes part of your ethos. And then culturally, if you transplant that, if I raise my children to be that way, and I make my community feel like that's part of their goal in life, then you'll generally see more productivity from that group of people. And I think Bitcoin, to a degree, has fostered that. It was certainly a big part of the early days, to talk to old monetary activists and cypherpunks and the people on the cryptography mailing list. I mean, who gets into cryptography? I mean, it was quite literally, especially that 12 years ago, it was primarily people that were interested in privacy as an aspect of human sovereignty and human rights generally. So these are the people that created things like PGP keys and those sorts of systems. Like public key cryptography was created by people that believed that humans have the right to communicate across adversarial channels, that an open internet is good in many ways, but that spying is an inherent problem of that system. And therefore we need encryption to be able to have free people communicate across hostile borders and that kind of thing. So Bitcoin already started with a lot of that sort of background freedom fighter aspect to it. So much so that the way that Bitcoin uses keys, the cryptography aspect of Bitcoin, isn't even to encrypt the ledger. The ledger is perfectly open. The cryptography aspect of it is about one establishment of identity and saying, these are my keys, and I can communicate over these channels with you using my keys as one attestation of my identity and my ownership, and to prove what I hold and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff there about identity and individual sovereignty and rights to a system that can't be grabbed arbitrarily. You can certainly be you can be implored, you can be forced if somebody were to break into my home and put a gun to my head. Like they could certainly coerce me to give them my bitcoins, but aside from that, there's not a penetrative way to break the system that way, and that is all very ideological. Those are the things that we big blockers, as BSV and BCH people, share with small blockers, the BTC people, that there is a sort of sovereignty to the system, and that ownership is absolute, and it should be taken very, very seriously. And it's funny because on the ledger, in the system itself, you can actually take people's coins. The technical part of that is very simple. It's just a couple of lines of code to reassign bitcoins from one place to another. But the thing that protects that is our competitive mining in the system, the need for the ledger to be trusted, and therefore the competition to secure the ledger better than everyone else. So it is a pure free market capitalist ideal that stops a single line of code from bankrupting somebody arbitrarily. And so it is truly a competitive free market system. It is the incentives of the system that keep it secure, because in a very basic sense, Bitcoin from a software and implementation standpoint is not unique. Like there aren't actually unique things about the technology. It is just the application. It is the economics. It is the philosophical aspects of Bitcoin that are unique. It is the rules of the game. And I'm going to give you a martial arts analogy because I'm a martial artist. If you look at the parentage of the grappling arts of Japan, or let's even just say the martial arts of Japan, they would call them Budo, which is basically the way of combat. So Budo is fight stuff in a very basic sense. Now you can break that into two trees. You can break that into the striking arts, which they would call the hard arts, or you can call or the grappling arts, which they would call the soft arts. So this is to punch or kick versus to grab and seize and wrestle, essentially. But if you look at the different sports, the parentage of things like judo, Japanese jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and all of these different things. I'm a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner, so this is lineage that I understand deeply. Judo and jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu are all actually the same art. They're the same thing. But what defines them is their rule set. So in judo, it is you get points for a very clean throw, but you're not allowed to grab the pants and you're not allowed to touch them below the waist until they're on the ground. And so that rule set defines how the game is played. Whereas in Japanese jiu-jitsu, which is typically not competitive, it's more so practiced for self-defense and for the art of things. But then in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, it's a much more open rule set. The rule set is basically choke them or joint lock them until they tap out. And otherwise, you can make your own path to that victory. And so Brazilian jiu-jitsu is very much a progressive art. It grows. It looks like a very different martial art every 10 years than it did the decade before. And it's because there isn't, I can't touch them there. I can't do this thing. I can't turn my back. I'll lose points if. And so they continue to find ways to, I never thought of this, but when I'm stuck in this position, I can create this wedge and then create this trap and then use this leverage against this person in such a way that they don't expect. But then as that idea propagates the network of other Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioners, people develop the defenses for it. And then it becomes the counters to those defensive. And then the art just continues to grow. And Bitcoin is very much the same way. It is a free market system where there are some rules, but they're very limited. They're also very clear. And since they are clear and limited, you can build whatever you want with the system. You can do something that's very data intensive, or you can do something that is very micropayments intensive, or you can build a business that is based entirely on massive liquidity. And it's really up to you what you can create. And other systems, they can't do that. Like, I'm not allowed to take US dollars over certain borders. I'm not allowed to take them into certain countries. I'm not allowed to do various types of business with them. I'm not allowed to even debase my own. If I tear my dollar, I've committed a federal offense and that kind of thing. And, you know, in Bitcoin, this is why I've always expected there to be an explosion in entrepreneurship. But right now it's this culture. There's an absurd culture among small blockers specifically that Bitcoin isn't for this and Bitcoin isn't for that. And you're not allowed to do this to the ledger. It's our ledger now. Don't spam the ledger. Don't think about the other people that might be hurt by you doing these things. And so they've put themselves in a mental box with rules that you can't break. And then they enforce them with their social mores. And this is very much why I'm a big blocker, is because I believe that it's a tool. There is no licensing agreement on a hammer when you buy it at the store. I can use the hammer to build anything I can think of that can be built with a hammer, and maybe something that nobody else has thought of. And that's truly, at least in my opinion, what Bitcoin was created for. And I believe that the more we release ourselves from these cultural pressure, this peer pressure about what Bitcoin is supposed to do, we're going to come up with things that nobody could have thought of prior.
And it's so number one, I do like the martial arts perspective. I've personally been very much a judo guy, so nice. I know the difference between having a judo fight and then having a Brazilian jiu-jitsu fight, because there are certain places where a judo fight would just be over, and the Brazilian jiu-jitsu fight is like, let's continue, right. and it's very confusing because there are certain places where I then see, oh, my skill set stops here because there was never a need to continue, which Precisely. Is very interesting. But I wanna pick a few of the things you said out and just try to make them explicit, because I think I'm looking for these good ideas, the economic, philosophical ideas in Bitcoin. And I heard you speak of a few things here. So I heard you, number one, speak of the worldview, which is not exclusive to Bitcoin, but just the worldview that is built into a system, but then also the worldview that every individual participant brings to a system. And the big question, can I, as the technocratic leader of the system, tell you that what your worldview wants to do with my system is okay or not? Or is it basically the question of, you'd bring whatever ideas you have, and all I can say is, cool. Which would basically be the protocol is set in stone perspective, is as long as it agrees with the protocol, do it. Yeah.
I mean, that brings up, presuppositions about what is good or what is authority, and who can define those things. And I don't know. We obviously don't have a definitive answer, certainly not globally, but I think we need to establish a worldview as people, and Bitcoin established that worldview. It very much planted a flag on the notions that freedom is good, that a sound and predictable emission policy on money is good, that absolute ownership is good, and therefore property rights by extension are a good thing, and that the simpler they are to enforce, the better. I think also that reducing economic friction is good. What else? I think that that being able to share data, sharing data in a way that is public and publicly auditable is good. And then the flip side of those things would be that fraud is bad. I think I come from Chicago. Chicago functions on a lot of fraud. Like, there's a lot of crime that happens in Chicago just as a matter of policy, that if you move into a certain neighborhood and you open a business, you're paying taxes to Chicago and those kind of things, but you're also paying the street tax. Like, there are the criminal elements of things that control neighborhoods and those sorts of things. And someone will walk in and say, hey, this is our neighborhood and you owe us this. And so Bitcoin establishes that that sort of thing is undesirable because there is no street tax in Bitcoin. Like, you will see every payment and every bit of coercion and that kind of thing is verifiable and it's provable, and it stops the sort of secret cash business that is allowed to happen or has been allowed to happen for many thousands of years now. And then I think the flip side too, to property being good, it's the fact that, communal, public proper shared property or tragedy of the commons sort of things are bad. That, that it's a good thing to stake a claim and secure the ledger based entirely on your own rational self-interest. That altruism in a Bitcoin system leads to attack of the system. It can lead to things like Sybil attacks and those sorts of things. So, it's funny because I think the world very much loves the concept of altruism, but Bitcoin is very much establishes that altruism is not desirable. Altruism is a security concern, and then it becomes a concern over the validity of your own property and that kind of thing. So I think those are some of the worldview things that Bitcoin very clearly establishes. I'd like to think that they're obvious and that people generally agree, but
which is very interesting when you speak about that, because the tragedy of the commons. So number one, whoever has not looked at that, it's fascinating, because I think as a concept and with all the experiments behind it, it kills so many of our pretty ideas of how the world should be. A lot of the shoulds get killed by the tragedy of the commons and the game theory behind it, basically. Yeah. But it brought me to comparison. On one hand, Bitcoin as a ledger being upkept by private companies, versus this idea that there is a government as an altruistic entity that works for the good of everybody by trying to keep up the economy, for instance, through controlling the money supply, the interest rates, the banks, which would be basically on the two sides of that idea of property, privacy, not privacy, but property and individual incentive, compared to this big nebulous government as the commons, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's a really interesting thing too. There's this notion in BTC that, well, every person should run their own node. Every person should participate in governance. And I've fought that idea for a very long time. Bitcoin is very clear that the only governance is your ability to contribute. That if you don't like a block, you need to orphan that block and build on top of a different block. You need to be able to mine a block. You need to have hash rate and proof of work. And I think it's funny that the small blocker notion is that it would be better for 50,000 people with a very small amount of incentive to protect the network are actually more trustworthy than someone that may have invested millions in infrastructural cost. And that brings me back to, the introduction of Marxism. It's a very Marxist thought right there, that, well, we can trust the people that work on the factory floor, but we cannot trust the managerial class because their incentives are misaligned. And I think it's a misunderstanding of human nature, and I think it's a misunderstanding of how people even want to treat each other. And there are obvious examples of bad capitalists, but that flies in the face of what we know about the good capitalists. So many good capitalists that want to build a better world and want to give products to good people. And when they do that, they profit from that, and that they have the ability to produce things better if their workers are happier people. And they don't need to be forced to do that. And some do. There are bad business owners, but by and large, a miserable working class is not going to be conducive to having a large growing customer base, for example. And a lot of this really comes down to philosophy. It's really is a philosophical worldview. And this is very much why I say that the BTC people very much have a pretty heavy dose of Marxist narrative that undergirds their worldview about Bitcoin, that they believe that there's something fundamentally untrustworthy about a large mining pool or a large miner, that their power, for whatever reason, is not fair or not earned, and that it cannot be trusted simply because it's large. And it's a very problematic worldview problem in my opinion. And that's really where big blockers and small blockers differ, is that big blockers really believe in the power of, I'm going to use the word capitalism again, but they believe that the incentives of the invested and industrial class are what keep the network safe and honest and secure and valuable. And small blockers believe that no, it is quite literally that proletariat class. It is the uprising of the little person that brings security and value and everything to the ledger. So I think if there's a fundamental philosophical reason that big blockers and small blockers split from each other, it really comes down to that. It is that you cannot trust the rich. And that's
do you have a sense of where that notion is coming from?
I mean, it comes from the culture separately. I think, Marxism is something that has been pervasive since the dawn of the industrial age. Like we see people getting replaced by machines, and that scares people who aren't as good as machines. And and it's a difficult thing, because you can break it down to any one person who's been displaced and made homeless or starved to death, and these kind of things, and say, well, that's a tragedy. And it is. It's an awful situation for that person. But if we're designing systems, if we're trying to design systems that benefit the most people and then benefit the culture as a whole and all of these things, it's better to be more free. And it fascinates me how many people say, no, it's better to be managed by smart people or talented people and that kind of thing. Because truly, people understand freedom as it applies to them. Everyone thinks they themselves should be more free, but that other people can't be trusted. This is everybody's thing. Everybody feels it in their heart that, I'm a good enough person to be given more freedom, more dispensation. And, but I don't know if I can trust my neighbors or my own family or the people I know from my real life. Like, maybe they should, the police exist to make sure I'm safe, that kind of thing. And, it's just it's a difficult thing culturally to think about being more free, because immediately people think of the worst situations in their lives or the worst example of people abusing their freedom or those kinds of things. But yeah, you have to zoom out. This is just like every other major cultural problem, is that if you zoom out and you look at, how we've moved from having kings to having parliaments to having, certain pockets where there's just, increasing freedom. Those are the things that we want to emulate. Those are the things that I believe Bitcoin was created to emulate and actually make easier. It's easier to manage less centrally planned governing structures because of Bitcoin as well. And it's difficult, because I think a lot of BTC people and truly like libertarian thought in general, I think a lot of libertarians are actually communists and they don't realize it, because they do have a fundamental distrust of other people's power, regardless of how it's earned. And I have a fear for unearned power and power that can't be taken away. I think that's very fair, but I do not fear power that's been earned by people that can lose it if they don't continue to earn that position of power. And that's another massive, and like that is proof of work. That's the fundamental definition of proof of work, and that's what secures Bitcoin.
I want to slow you down right there, because I actually think that is incredibly profound and central to the whole idea of Bitcoin. Power has to be earned, and power can be taken away. And I would want to add one really important thing. There are honest rules underlying that, which is, I think, it's fascinating that I think honesty is potentially the word most used in the white paper, or one of the words. It's not cryptography, it's honesty, or honest. And the thing, because if I take that small step back to, there are people who have a lot of power, who have a lot of wealth, who have a lot of influence in the economic system. I can really get why people would be scared of that, because I think right now we live in a world where there are people in positions of power that have not earned that, and where nobody has any possibility of doing anything against it. So I really get that, and I think that's where this conflation of capitalism and crony capitalism is very much people's lived experience right now, but it's not philosophically the same thing. And I think that's a really important distinction. But if we were in a situation where people had to earn their position could be taken away if they didn't continue to perform how they got there. And the rules were clear, and people could check it because the ledger is public. That would be a different game than what we see played worldwide right now.
Yeah, I mean, to the tune of, trillions of dollars in money and in just an incredible amount of unearned power. I mean, we still have dictatorships. I mean, look at somewhere like North Korea, for example. I mean, that they do not have access to the outside world. Or even if you go, like, land in Shanghai, go to China and try to access your Gmail account. You can't do it. Then try to access Facebook and you can't do it. And then try to, you start to realize, wow, this is a completely closed culture. Like they don't even have access without a lot of extra work to see what folks like us are doing. I mean, you and I live in the Western world, and the Western world genuinely has its own problems with censorship and some of that as well. But we do have access to each other. You're in Germany, if I recall.
Yes.
And and I'm in the US, and we can just, hey man, here's a link. Let's have a conversation over Zoom, and then we can
record it and give it to other people.
Yes, and I mean, what an incredible thing. I mean, my parents, or I mean, let's say my grandparents. If my grandparents, when they were our age, if they were, you look like we're about this, and we're in our 30s, right? How old are you?
So 32. Thanks.
Yeah. So we're about the same age. We would have been in the same high school. I'm 35 years old. And so when our grandparents were in their 30s, they would have never imagined the ability to have a face-to-face conversation between people that were 5,000 miles apart or whatever, and that kind of thing, and cross those lines, much less even Germany and the United States and my grandparents' generation were at war with one another. And so, we look at these things and say, hey, we have so much in common, even though we come from very different places. We have much more in common as individual people that are trying to compete in the world and try to build something of value and try to show the world that, hey, I may only be here for 60 to 100 years, but the things that I do matter, and I want to propagate my ideas and maybe even share my genetics so that they continue to go on after I die, and that kind of thing. And places like China or to an even greater degree, North Korea, just don't have that opportunity at all whatsoever. It's not something that they can just hop on, enjoy, and do freely. And that's a pocket of control that we see the consequences of. I mean, these people, I mean, what's the greatest invention to ever come out of North Korea? And
there are some there. I don't know if you've ever listened to Michael Malice on North Korea. If not, I can really recommend it, because there's the North Korean opera, which is a revolutionary, because they've moved the choir from the stage next to the stage.
Ah, brilliant. And that's what you see. So, I mean, the more control that you have over a system, the more you don't see innovation and computer science or industrial manufacturing or in communications technology. And, these people can barely figure out how to feed a nation of people. And the individuals there aren't terribly different. If you were to adopt a North Korean baby and raise them in Germany, they would, in all likelihood, be a normally performing student and adult, and they have every opportunity to become, the CEO of the biggest company in Germany, and like that's, so it's not that there's a problem with the people, genetically or anything else. It is a problem with the culture, and the culture is held down maliciously to the benefit of really a single family and whoever's connected to the Kim family in charge there in North Korea. And I think that's a fantastic example to show that freedom creates things that can't be created under oppression. But there are things that oppression creates too. I mean, I've known people that have escaped North Korea. I actually used to work sort of tangentially with an organization that would produce deprogramming videos for people that escaped North Korea. So if they were able to make it over the border into South Korea, I mean, once they, make sure, hey, are you healthy? Have you been, whatever, how malnourished are you after making that journey? To put a video together and basically watch for about an hour and explain what the world looked like after the Korean War, because they are so unaware of the outside world. I mean, they literally believe things like that the United States has conquered the rest of the planet except for North Korea, and everyone is starving to death. And the only reason it's as good as it is in North Korea is because of the great might of the North Korean military to hold back this terrible onslaught of evil people. And, when they see that, oh my God, like K-pop exists and, the rest of the world has something like the internet, and that there's just everything else, everything outside of North Korea, and the people there are just, they're destroyed by it because their entire world is fake. But the one thing that oppression creates is a strength that people that you and I can't relate with. There's something that made them run past those police that would gun them down. There's something that hunger and that want can build in you that nothing else can. And so you generally see those people, once they get over their sort of their shock, that post-traumatic stress, and truly the post-traumatic stress will stay with them for the rest of their lives. But once they get over the initial, like, oh my God, everything is a lie, you tend to see people that have left there appreciate this freedom so much more. And it makes them more able to thrive because they see the opportunity through lenses that you and I can't relate with. And so that's the power of oppression. The most beautiful thing about oppression is to pluck people from it and and to see what they're capable of creating. And to bring that back to Bitcoin, this is the other thing that I'm so excited about, is that there's about 3 billion people on Earth that have zero access to the global economy. They just don't have any access to it at all. They're oppressed, maybe not even maliciously, but they're just oppressed by circumstance and just a lack of access to information or infrastructure, all these different things. And Bitcoin allows people that are born in the middle of nowhere today to interact with the global economy in a way that wasn't possible to their parents. And it allows them to sell things, hopefully to my children, that my children will want to buy, because an entrepreneurial idea came from somebody that saw the new world and saw this new technology and said, I'm going to create something with that. And only they are capable of creating it because they knew what it was like to live in a place without electricity or plumbing or modern medicine and all these different things. And so there's a massive opportunity there to both benefit them, to really make the developing world a better place. But the benefit to people like us who live in the developed world is to benefit from the entrepreneurship of those people that have been held back up until this point. And the amount of economic opportunity there really can't be calculated. And then there's the whole human and spiritual aspect of it too, of, bringing the entire world out of poverty and with real efficiency and access. It's just, I mean, it's the most exciting thing I think that exists today, frankly, which is why I'm so passionate about it.
For me, so I have about 20 different places we could go with this, but I think even just talking about the African kid that has the possibility of joining the economy, I think this is again coming to that worldview point of adding one person or 5 people or 1 billion people that each individually can contribute to the economy, and that the ingenuity, the drive, the possibilities that brings is actually worth so much more than oh, let's control this. No, you can't put that on chain. It's the generative effect of including all these humans and human ingenuity and having a positive view on that is actually something that I see very much in the BSV space. Is this, let's include these people because I don't even know what they could bring, but it will probably be awesome.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and that's one thing. I just returned from Coingeek conference in Zurich, and I met a number of gentlemen from the Middle East who are very, very excited to be new representatives to the Bitcoin Association and bring these ideas to their people. And there's a big difference between people that have lived in places like Lebanon or Iran and some of these places that have experienced a lot of very difficult times over the last generation, compared to the people that have lived in the UAE, for example. And Dubai has went from nothing 30 years ago to now, I mean, one of the most incredible bastions of capitalism in the world, where you can see what free markets are actually capable of, and seemingly it's big buildings and beautiful resorts,
and really strange islands.
Yes. yeah gosh, the archaeologists of that area, what happened here? So but it's incredible though. I had a meal in Zurich with a guy from the Middle East, and his excitement was incredible. Like, he's looking at these things and saying, look at the access we can have. He developed it's an invoicing system. I forget the name of it, but a way to use the blockchain to verify invoices in such a way where there's not a communications problem. And a lot of people, if you don't understand logistics industries, like, there's an incredible amount of loss just in between people overpaying and underpaying because the communications channels are just slow. And when you can fix that problem, it frees up so much capital that can be reinvested into all kinds of things. And like, just to talk to somebody that's just seeing that for the first time reminds me that, hey, I'm not crazy, because I'm so embroiled in it. I just think it's so obvious. But I'm like the preacher that met his first atheist, and I'm like, wait, how is this possible? But but to see the conversion, to see somebody say, hey man, over the last year I've really looked into it, and the solution makes the most sense for my business for fundamental business reasons. And it really reminds me that that's who we're building for. Like, that's what adoption actually looks like. It's not, hey, I convinced somebody, locally to go buy some Bitcoin, and now, whatever, now we're in the same boat together. But really, to see someone from a completely different culture with completely different problems and all kinds of different challenges, to look at the ledger and say, I didn't create an invoice system. That's not what I would first think to do. But he looked at it and said, this solves my invoicing problem, and that will allow me to be more profitable and to lose less money and to interact with the economy the way I see fit to.
It's exactly what you want the logistics person to do. You want the coder to find the problem, and you want the logistics person to be like, there is ineffectiveness. We can solve that.
Exactly. And so, I mean, it's just, what an incredible opportunity. It really, it can't be overstated how much value there is that can come from this technology if it's treated that way. And we really need an increasing amount of people to really treat it that way, to solve these fundamental economic problems. So,
which maybe as a last point, because we had a 1 hour slotted in.
yeah.
You talked about the North Korean system. I would actually look at that even though we're in the Western world, we're seemingly free. In many ways, the way business is done, the way structures work here, we're in North Korea too, we just don't know it. There are so many places where we don't have choice, and we don't even realize that we don't have choice. The way banking works, the way certain structures are necessary, going to, I want to have payments on the internet. All I can do is PayPal, Visa, that's about it. So in so many places, we are not free either. And actually that's where we can find more freedom, which then will free up so much more possibility in the Western world too.
For sure. You know, I've always said you can't have, like, freedom is not on a sliding scale. Tyranny is. But freedom, to actually be free, is an absolute concept. It is you cannot be 99% free. If you're 99% free, there's tyranny in your life. Like, you're back on the tyranny scale. And that's certainly where we are. And I actually love that you said that about, hey, we're on a scale with North Korea, because it's true.
It's a weird way to look at it, but it is.
It's true though. It's funny. So I went from Chicago to Miami. I spent a week in the Miami, Florida area before going to Zurich, Switzerland. And just to see the difference in the way that they're treating their pandemic protocols is a really fascinating indicator of that sliding scale of tyranny. And Switzerland is very locked down, like, and including, when I was there, it was fascinating to see hey, pull the mask up over your nose. Like, and that's the kind of thing that if somebody said that in Florida, I mean, nobody's even wearing masks anywhere in Florida. So they look at it and say, only idiots think there's a pandemic. And then you get to Zurich and say, well, only fools would treat this as if it's not a dire medical emergency that needs to be managed by the state. And both of those views come from a good place, actually. Like, these are people that think they're doing the right thing for other people. And like I said earlier at the beginning of this conversation, that's how Trotsky felt. That's how Hitler felt. This is how Mussolini felt. Mussolini is sitting there and saying, how can I do the best thing for the Italian people? And it's very difficult to deal with the fact that nobody wakes up in the morning and says, well, I'm evil, and I'm going to do an evil thing, and it's what's going to make me feel good. And these are things that creep up on you. These are things that, you look back and say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have done these things. And we see it even with, if you read the Nuremberg trials and stuff about that, and you see these officers that helped manage things like these death camps and stuff that happened at the end of World War II. And a lot of them, they look back and they say, I followed policy. Like, this was my job. Who am I were I to say no, I would just be put in the prison. I would be shot, or I would be put in a labor camp myself. But these are the same thing. This is what the police say too. Like, why did you do these things this way? And it's systemic. It's a matter of policy. It's not me, the individual. My individual responsibility goes out the window because command structures. And it's like, these are all things on the sliding scale of tyranny. But in reality, in real life, like, these are individual decisions to make. People decide to be executioners, and people decide to join the fascist party or join a violent wing of Antifa or whatever. They decide to be that person to say, I'm going to enforce my ideals with violence if necessary. And then those ideas breed too. And ultimately, these are attempts to reestablish proof of stake in things, that my idea cannot be just propagated through work. My ideas maybe aren't good enough for people to just understand them and adopt them and for them to grow this way. They need to be pushed. They need force behind them. They need authority of the state, or the authority of the state that I want to exist. But these are proof of stake ideas. The state is the very nature of stake. That's it. They were here first. I was born in the state that I live in, and there's nothing to do about it because it preceded me. Their power preceded my existence. And so their authority is that proof of stake. And it's going to take a whole hell of a lot of proof of work to supplant that. And that's another thing that Bitcoin does. This is why Bitcoin is freedom technology, because if we can generate that much more proof of work than they have proof of stake, we free everybody by making their stake obsolete. Things become very silly and then they go away. It's when people laugh at the police, not because they're not a threat now. Like, this is not a place we're at today, but at some point we're going to look at government authority and say, why would I consent to that? What, like, you can't do that. And I'll finish with a church analogy because I love my church analogies. If we go 500 years ago,
can I just come in quickly before the church analogy? Because
yes,
I think that's again super interesting to basically turn proof of stake, proof of work into fundamental philosophical concepts of looking at the world like that. I've seen you do that a couple of times, but it is an interesting one.
Crucial.
But how it ties into the rest of our conversation, just to make that explicit, is if we look at Bitcoin as freedom, and freedom being essentially the individual having freedom to choose, then the freedom is you offer, through your work, you offer something I want to participate in. And if you don't offer that anymore, I withdraw my choice. That's my freedom. Yes. Whereas the proof of stake is, to do this, I need to participate in this big pie. And I have to go to the places that already have the pie. And once I'm in, I can't get my crumbs that I put in the pie back. So I got to stay in the pie. And that would be the distinction between the proof of stake and proof of work on a monetary level. But from that, it would automatically, because in essence, what we call states nowadays are quite complex money systems. So as soon as the money changes, the state would change. The place we live in would change, because we would suddenly have choices we didn't have before. And basically what the fundamental idea in Bitcoin seems to be, and that you seem to be pointing to, is giving people more of that choice. And that choice is based on the proof of work.
Yep. So my church example, just briefly. So for 1500 years, let's just talk about the establishment of Christianity. For about 1500 years, the church was able to use violence, raise armies, demand tithing as a sort of taxation. They were able to arrest you, imprison you, beat you. All of these things were functions of the church. And it's because the church was the main controller of information. Information flowed better through the church than through any other rails. Countries didn't communicate with each other. The French and the Germans and the British and the Spanish, they didn't like each other. But the Catholic churches in those countries were able to freely communicate. People would send letters and writers and all these different things. And so information was controlled by the church. And it wasn't revolution. There were plenty of opportunities to have revolt and violence overthrow the church, but they didn't work. But what did work, what made the church become voluntary, what made people able to withdraw their consent from the Catholic Church, was not any one revolt. It was the last revolt that occurred after the advent and the distribution of the printing press. It was when information became liberated, when people were able to print books and disseminate information in a way that broke down the control of information from the Catholics. And ultimately, the Protestant Revolution, or the Reformation, but we'll call it the Revolution, led to all kinds of other things. It led to the rise of agnosticism and science and all of these different things too. It created an intellectual competitor and an informational competitor to the Catholic Church, to the point where today our relationship with the church is completely voluntary. You can go to a Catholic, they still exist, they're still there. You can participate in their governance voluntarily, and you can withdraw your consent at will. And it's because we now laugh at the notion that the Catholic Church could show up and knock on your door and say, hey, you didn't tithe this week, you owe us money, or you've sinned in such a way, you're under arrest and you're going to sit in a jail cell at your local Catholic parish. And so the world changes because freedom and information are intrinsically bound together. It allowed people to function outside of their information silos. And that's the other aspect that Bitcoin SV specifically, no other version of Bitcoin allows you to compete on that dissemination of information aspect. And so it's a really crucial thing to understand, is that if you want the government to actually become laughable, if you want to be able to withdraw your consent from your state, then you need to remove their exclusive control over the information that they have. And only BSV allows that to happen in a way that can be valuable, so that the proof of work can be applied also to information and empower people that in 500 years, our great-great-grandchildren will have the same conversation about the state that you and I just had about the church. It's like, man, can you believe that police could arrest you and put you, like, it's just absurd. And so we're on this trajectory toward freedom because of Bitcoin, but it's so crucial to get this right and to let the proof of work make the decisions about what Bitcoin is and means and does for the world.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lucas.
You never know what's around the